Hey, it's Sarah with GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we are here to talk about books in just a moment or two. Before we get to the books, though, I want to talk to you about bedding. Maybe you want to curl up and just read all weekend, snuggled in your nice warm bed. Maybe as you're doing that, you think, it'd be nice to have some different new sheets, maybe in some really great classic colors. Well, have I got a deal for you. If you go to linensandhutch.com, that's linensandhutch.com, and enter the promo code GSMC book at checkout, you will receive 70% off of their entire website, plus free shipping. That's 70% off of their sheet sets, including their bamboo sheet sets, which are delightful. Their reversible down alternative comforters, their quilts, their mattress toppers, everything. You can get a whole bed, a whole new bed. I mean, the covers, right? Not the actual mattress and bed frame. A whole new bed for 70% off. Their colors, as I said, are classic. You get 100 nights to try everything that you buy to see if you like it. If not, send it back. Money back guaranteed. But the best part here is go to their website, linensandhutch.com, enter the promo code GSMCBOOK at checkout, and you will receive 70% off of their entire website and free shipping. You don't want to miss this.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I want to wish you a happy Friday. I hope you have something interesting planned for the weekend, even if that is only sitting around drinking tea or coffee and reading a good book. When I think about, sitting around drinking tea and coffee right now, I think about doing that in the sunshine because we're finally getting cooler temperatures here in Northern California. And by cooler temperatures, I mean it's still in the upper 70s, which is lovely. It's no longer in the 90s, which it had been up until about a week or 10 days ago. But for my parents who are in Montana, and for lots of people in Montana who I've been seeing posts on Facebook, it's snowing. Yeah, it's already snowing. This is not uncommon. It often snows in October, but the pictures show a pretty heavy snowfall, and it's. Then I think of sitting inside with a blanket and hot chocolate or hot apple cider and my book and just staring out at the snowfall. But we don't have that here, so that's okay. I don't know. We could compromise maybe. I could send them some of my extra warmth and they could send me some of their cool, maybe in the form of rain. That would be awesome. And then we could compromise like maybe somewhere in the 50s. That'd be nice for everybody, right? Nice fall 50s temperatures. Alas, it doesn't work like that. So I hope your week has been going well. I hope you've had a wonderful week. I am trying to talk myself into going to the urgent care to get antibiotics because I have a sinus infection. You can probably hear. If you're a regular listener of the podcast, you know that this is not unusual for me. Despite having sinus surgery almost 8 years ago, I still get regular sinus infections. They're not as bad as they used to be. I will say that, but still. Get them several times a year, always procrastinate about going to the doctor, and then finally do. So that's what I'm trying to convince myself to do today. Go to urgent care, get some antibiotics, start feeling better. You know what makes me feel better? Books. Talking about books. Yep. Talking about books and talking to authors about their books. I love those conversations. As I mentioned in the end of the last episode, today I am speaking with author Alice C. Early about her book, The Moon Always Rising. It is kind of a period piece. I mean, not exactly, but it's not contemporary. It was written at the end of the last century, so before we got into the 2000s, and the description is as follows. When her life in Scotland cracks apart, feisty Eleanor Els Gordon exiles herself to a derelict plantation house on the Caribbean island of Nevis, only to discover she's cohabiting with the ghost of its former owner. The ghost must leave this world. Els must figure out how to go on living in it. As they each test the power of forgiveness, she helps him atone for his messy life while he prods her to reclaim her courage, untangle long-held family secrets, and allow herself to risk loving again. So, as you know, I am trying to catch up from the last couple of months that have been insane. And I'm kind of happy that I'm not happy that this got pushed off. I apologize, Alice. But I am kind of happy that now we get to talk about it in October because, Halloween, and we've got a ghost in this. Jack is not I don't know if he's your typical ghost. What is a typical ghost? He is irreverent. He is a little snarky. He just kind of appears and scares Els, not in like a haunting ghostly. He just like when somebody sneaks up on you and they just are there. And so he and Els have to figure out how to help each other. She ends up on Nevis after her boss tells her to take a vacation. And so she goes there and immediately falls in love with this very strange house that has a very odd and interesting reputation, ends up buying the house. And then the rest you have to find out for yourself. But obviously, since the back tells us there is a ghost and there are family secrets, because what would be the fun of a book if she just fell in love with the house, moved in, and that was it? I mean, that's awesome, but books involve putting our characters through something, and in this case there's a lot going on. There's a little romance hidden in there in a way, and not with the ghost. No, shush, weirdos. Sorry. Anyway, yes, she does go home to Scotland, which is cool, and then there's the contrast between Scotland and Nevis, which I find fun. So without further ado, let's go ahead now and turn to the interview with Alice C. Early. Again, the book is called The Moon Always Rising. Hi, Alice. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah. It's wonderful to talk to you.
I am very excited to have you here. We are going to talk about your book, The Moon Always Rising. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Okay. I live on the island of Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts. It's in the news. People have heard about it ever since the Clintons came here and put us on the map, I guess. And I live in a really isolated and very rural part of the island. I have been writing for a long time, but only business. I had a long business career traveling all over the world, was a partner in an international firm, and moved here in 1999. And at that point, one of the things I wanted to do was to go back to writing, because that was my college major. I was an English major with a creative writing concentration. But I had set it aside for all those decades. And so I told myself I was going to do that. Well, it was a lot harder than I thought. So I have been working very hard on this book, which has taken a really long time to produce, and it is my debut novel, and I am thrilled to have a book that I wrote out into the world. It's kind of like a life goal, and I'm just so excited that it's out there, and I love talking to people about it and about what it's like to be a writer when you've already had a long career.
Yeah, that's so exciting to have, that the realization of that dream in a tangible form.
It really is. And, to have it be a book you can pick up and hold and share with people is, they say it's a real thrill, and believe me, it really is.
Oh, I would imagine. Yeah. That's great. So, as I said, the book is called The Moon Always Rising. Can you give a bit of an overview about the story?
Sure. The book is about a Scottish woman's struggle to remake her life on the tiny Caribbean island of Nevis. And it's also about how she and the other characters have to embrace the power of forgiveness, the power of love, in order to free themselves up from their pasts, which are in various ways binding them. The main character is a woman named Els Gordon, who goes by Els, a childhood nickname. She's really lost everything that matters to her, either by impulsively tossing it away or by having it ripped from her. And she's an investment banker in London. Her boss demands that she take a vacation to get a grip on herself because she's kind of cracking apart and it's affecting her work. So she goes to Nevis and she becomes obsessed with this boarded up plantation house. And when she sinks her savings into renovating it and fleeing there from Scotland, she finds out she's cohabiting with the ghost, which in local parlance is a jumbie, of the former owner, whose name was Jack Griggs. And he may have drowned, perhaps by suicide, but they're both stuck. He can't leave this world because he needs to make amends with two of the women that he most loved and most wronged. And she is stuck because her mother abandoned her when she was only 2, fled back from Scotland to her native Italy, and nobody in the family will talk about it. So Els is damaged as a child, and she is wounded, and it is what has been sort of ruling her life, and she needs to find out what happened. So she invites her mother to Nevis once she gets grounded there enough to be bold enough to do that, and then the sparks really fly. So that's basically what it's about. But it's a love story inside of a redemption story with a wide cast of characters drawn from both Scotland and primarily from Nevis, where I've been visiting for many, many years.
Yeah, there's a lot of different layers to the book. So within those layers, you also get some different genres. You know, as you said, it's a love story. So you've got the romance element, you've got Jack's ghost, you've got the paranormal element. Mm-hmm. Did you set out to write a multi-genre novel, or did it just sort of evolve that way?
I did not set out to write a multi-genre novel. Had I known what a challenge that would be in the publishing world, I would probably never have done it. I didn't know any better. I just had a story that I wanted to tell. And so elements of romance are there, but it's not anything that looks like a regular romance novel. It doesn't adhere to norms. There is a ghost, but my ghost came more from the Latin American tradition of magical realism than from any kind of paranormal, Casper the Ghost kind of ghost. And I was using a lot of the folklore and the superstitions of the islands, which I researched deeply, to inform me about how a ghost, a jumbie, might actually behave. And then I went about and wrote him the way I wanted to, which was more like a living person who has these quirky attributes. And so, it's part mystery because of the mystery of what happened with the mother and what happened to some of these other characters. But it's not a straight up the line mystery. I wouldn't know how to write one of those. People tell me it's a page turner, but it was never intended to be a thriller. So I guess that's the way it happened.
I can certainly see how that would happen in the writing process. We are going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. But when we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about that multi-genre aspect of writing, about this book in particular. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, you got to hear a little bit about Alice, a little bit about the book. So let's go ahead and get back to the interview about The Moon Always Rising with author Alice C. Early.
You're not the first author that I've spoken with who has a book that covers multiple genres. And so I'm wondering if eventually there's going to be a shift where we don't have to try to fit everything into its appropriate little box, that maybe we can figure out how to market things in a broader category. I don't know what that looks like, but
but
maybe
I think if you look at what's going on in the romance world and how, people used to say, oh, those are just bodice rippers, but now they're really a voice of women writing for women. And they're taking on all kinds of life challenges and all kinds of stories. And, it's not, it's the genre itself is sort of busting apart, I think. And I see in some of the books I read, I see experimentation of, sort of stepping over the line in all kinds of ways. And I think readers seem to have been extremely tolerant of that for me. If I'd marketed it as a romance, readers of romance who were expecting something would have been disappointed, I think, because it doesn't adhere to those norms. But I think that readers are sort of hungry for stories, and they don't really care what genre they're in.
Yeah, and I don't think you can, you can't really market it as simply paranormal or supernatural because, like you said, it's not your typical ghost, and it's not your typical. It's not a paranormal romance because the romance is not associated with the paranormal. I like the ghost. I like Jack in this story because of you're right. He is very human. He pops up at one point and scares the crap out of elves. And he's like, well, let's see. I could drag some chains, or you could give me a bell. Like he's not your typical ethereal, sort of lurking in the shadows. Nobody quite sees him. I mean, he's there, and he has full-on conversations with elves. Right.
And not everybody does see him. I mean, I think that is part of the superstition, which is that if you are receptive, as he says, then you can see him. And only a few of the characters in the book are receptive. Els is, the herbalist / exorcist Miranda is, and a child is. But they're people who are kind of in tune with the spirit world and open to that. Other people don't see him at all, and even though he's quite clear to Els, and when I made him up, I just was focusing on this kind of pain in the ass man, who was needy and petulant and smart, but very much in his own way, self-destructive, all kinds of things. And I decided, okay, so that's the character that Jack was in life. So why would he be different as a ghost? So all of those characteristics that made up the man that I made up for him to have been in his life are what he is as a ghost.
Absolutely. Let's switch back to Els a little bit now. She is the main character. She is Scottish. She's kind of an outsider on Nevis. But what about Els do you think might resonate with readers as the main character?
I think Els is a hard character to like in the beginning. And that was my intent. She's very prickly. She's, as I said before, she's damaged. You don't know why at first. She looks like she's got a pretty good life going, but it cracks apart. And then I think that she has to go on a pretty tough emotional journey to be able, after the losses that she suffered, to open up again. She's always kind of pulled inward to begin with. She's prickly in order to justify that people don't like her. She's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of the way she behaves. And she needs to get over herself, but that's not an easy journey for her. And so I think that what makes people resonate with her, and they tell me that they really do, if they hang in there just a few chapters until they begin to see why she is the way she is, then they're on her side. And, they want her to be able to open up, to be able to be more courageous about her relationships and less reticent and less prickly. But it takes her a while. It doesn't happen. No, you can't flip a switch to get over a lifelong set of habits. Mm-hmm. So I think that they do very much relate to her when they realize how much she is trying to shed and overcome in order to be able to have a new life.
I agree. And she's kind of difficult to like at the beginning, although even at the beginning, she's intriguing enough that you want to know why she is this way, because you can tell that there's something else, or in this case, a lot of something else is going on. I had to laugh at the one character who said to her toward the beginning of the book, try going an hour without saying something bitchy or something along those lines. And
she has at that point encountered a man who figures largely in the rest of the book, and she's a bitch. Mm-hmm. And she's a bitch out of terror, but that's kind of her fallback position, is when she's threatened, is to become a bitch. And he calls her on it. And a lot of characters actually in this book call her on things, on her assumptions about all kinds of stuff, including Jack the Jumbie. And they pull her up short and force her to confront who she is and how she got that way and how she's coming across.
And on the other hand, she is a woman in a male-dominated field. There are very few men in her line of work, especially because this book starts in 1998, so it's a little bit in the past, and things are, enough different from how they are now that.
Hello.
Hello. My phone.
Are you back?
Yeah, just.
All of a sudden, I heard music.
Yeah, my phone just disconnected. Just hung up
okay.
on me. I was like, I don't know where I was. Male-dominated field.
You were talking about her male-dominated world. Maybe we should start that question over again. So I don't think we could piece it back together. But you had just finished saying, she's working in a male-dominated field, different in '98 than it would be now, and that's about where we lost it.
Yes. So I guess I would say talk about. It's a multifaceted question. So first, talk about your decision to set it, a little over 20 years ago, and then also talk about how that affects Elle's reactions to being in a male-dominated field, how that might be different from how she might have reacted if it were set in more current times.
Okay. Well, I set it in between 98 and 2000, primarily because I had started to write it, or started to make notes for it back then. I was at that time living in New York, and I was very much in a male-dominated business. my whole career, really, I was one of the first women to do whatever. So I was, in positions where I was the first, the only, or the youngest woman in the room, and all the time in my career. And that has changed, thank goodness. But I chose investment banking because it is then and still is very male dominated. I wanted Els to be ambitious and to be fighting against situations where her ambition and her abilities were not going to be enough to let her prevail, because there was this undercurrent of gender bias and sexism that were really holding her back. And when I started to write the book, or started to outline the book, a couple of years into that process, 9/11 struck. And I had been living in New York until 99 and was still going back there a lot in the early 2000s. And having seen how much of, that was one of those cataclysmic events where there's a before and an after. And what we had before and what we had after were so different. You didn't have to live in New York to have that event really affect your life. And I didn't feel that I could write a book after 2000, because I would have had to deal with what happened in 9/11, and that was too complicated for what I was trying to do. So I decided that I needed to stop the book by 2000, and that the frame of the book going from 98 onward, but 98 is really almost flashback in the book, because it starts in 99. It starts in November of 99, and it goes until basically into the new year, just 2 New Years of 2000 to 2001. And I stopped there because I just couldn't. That was just too big of an issue to deal with. And when I started writing, we were still really in it. It's almost as if you were trying to write a novel now and not deal with the pandemic, because that's, again, a watershed event, and there's a before and an after. And how we lived before and how we will live after are not the same thing. And I think you couldn't write a book next year and ignore it, just as I couldn't write that book in the early 2000s and ignore 9/11, especially as somebody who had been living in New York. So that's why I chose that time. But the other reason was that the Nevis of 2000, of 99, before this century, was a less developed, arguably even more charming place than it is now. I watched it change, and I really wanted to set the book in the Nevis kind of as I first experienced it, because I first went there in 96. And I thought, this is just, in a way, very enchanting. And I wanted to capture that from the eyes of a hardworking businesswoman coming from elsewhere. What would that do to her? Because I had my own feelings about how it had entranced me. So that's really why I did it. I didn't see any other way to do it.
Jumping back in so we can take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we will be talking about Elle's perspective as an outsider, as the protagonist who is an outsider in this culture that is not her own. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Alice Early about what else? Books, of course. We are speaking about her new novel, The Moon Always Rises. Let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
You said something. You said, hardworking businesswoman. She comes to this place. So Els is really, an outsider. She comes in and is almost immediately entranced with this house that she then buys rather impulsively. But she is an outsider, and she is a white European woman on an island that has a history of slavery, et cetera. And so she really comes in with a unique perspective, but also kind of a complicated perspective. And so can you talk a little bit about her as an outsider coming in, buying a house, starting a business, and how those tensions play out in the book?
Yeah, I think anybody who moves to a place where they have only vacationed has a set of expectations that are quite different from what it turns out to be when they actually live there. And because I live on a tourist island, I see that all the time, where people buy a home or make a second home here, and then they decide they're going to retire here, or they're going to live here, and then they find out that it's really quite different from what it was like for those 3 weeks in the summer. So I've been playing with that issue of what is it like to be a local, and what is it like to be a stranger to a place, and what eyes do you bring as a stranger that make your interpretation of what you're seeing actually wrong. She comes with expectations that are so incorrect that it causes her to get herself in trouble. She also comes from a position of white privilege. When I started writing this book, I wasn't as much thinking about that as I was as the writing went on. And I began to think about, what is it about coming to a place where it is an island that is run by people of color. It is their home. It is their island. She is an outsider. And there are many white expatriates there. Some of them are the ones who have the money. There is still a real struggle to make a living in the islands because of the economy. And Nevis is a place that has a really deep history in the slave trade because it was one of the most profitable sugar islands. Its volcanic soil made it incredibly productive. And it was fought over by different nationalities for years and went back and forth between British and French, whatever. So she is, and what she discovers is that she's complicit in that because her family wealth, which by the time she goes to Nevis has been lost, but her family wealth must have come in some part from the triangle trade. And she never even thought about that. And so now she's living with the after effects of that slavery. And there's a lot of layers of her coming to grips with her expectations and her sense of isolation in wealth that she's lost. And what does that mean to her now that she has to make a living, has to make a living by the terms of the place where she lives, has to come to grips with her own personal history and her mother. And what she fantasized about her mother turns out not at all to be true. There's just a lot of, as you said, layers of her consciousness about herself that get peeled away. And I think that happens when you go to a place as a stranger and you shrug off all the comforts of what you might have had at home, the expectations, and you're vulnerable. And she makes herself vulnerable in the way that a newcomer to a place that she doesn't understand completely is vulnerable. And only when she is that vulnerable can she begin to make sense of herself and her life and, kind of come out of this cocoon that she's been in. So I thought that her perspective as an outsider and as a stranger was so critical to her coming of age in a way, coming of age emotionally, her willingness to open her eyes. When she says that she goes back to painting, which was a childhood thing that she did, she said it's partly my way of seeing things, that she's looking really closely at what's in her environment and trying to get it right in her paintings. And I think that that's part of her sense of, I don't really know what I'm seeing unless I really pay attention. There's a theme in the book of paying attention. I think if I were writing this now, I might have gone more heavily into some of the interracial underpinnings of making a decision like she did. But the book was all written and already at press before we ended up in the Black Lives Matter kind of conversation that we're having now. And yet, I think all my life, some of those issues have been bouncing around in my brain that have to do with social inequality and the differences between people's expectations for life based on things they can't control and how institutionalized that is. So these are not new themes for me, but they crept into the book. I wasn't sitting down to write about that, but I couldn't keep them out.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think if you had kept them out, it would have read as false, because there is this, it would just be a giant elephant in the room that hadn't been addressed.
Yeah, and I think it would have been a far less honest and deep book, because then it would have been, wealthy woman goes to an island and, tries to have a romance. That's not what I wanted to write at all. So it was these other layers that really made it, to me, interesting, and I hope and I think to readers as well.
Yeah. So what kinds of research did you do for the book?
A ton. One of my friends jokes to me that who didn't know me, but we've become friends because of the book. She said, well, the one thing I knew about you as a writer was that you were Scottish. I thought, okay, I guess I pulled that one off. But I have never been to Scotland. So that was all researched. I read Scottish writers. I read history. I looked at maps. I did a lot of research on Scotland. What's the food like? What's the animals like? What kind of eagles do they have there, et cetera. I researched a lot about the Caribbean and Nevis, reading its history. I'm a foodie, so I delved into the foodways, and I made her a person who doesn't know how to cook. But had I been writing about myself, she would have been experimenting and learning how to cook. And I went to the farmers markets. I hung out with, just sat and observed. Finney is based on a character. He's an amalgam, but he's based in part on a man that I used to watch fishing all the time. And a lot of the characters are based on people that I knew there, or that I mushed together, people that I had known there. But I'm just one of those people who stops in the middle of a sentence and goes to the internet and researches whether or not that could have happened. Is the timing right? Is the, I had to research Scottish politics to be able to write about devolution and the separatist movement. I had to research Nevis politics, even though I'd lived through some of it, to understand how deeply held some of those secessionist feelings are between Nevis and St. Kitts. I did a lot of research on Anguilla, where I've also spent a lot of time because one of the lead characters is from there, and his history and Anguilla's history, which is bound up with Nevis's history, had to inform how he thinks and how he behaves. So it was just really a lot. And if you write a book over a long period of time, you can indulge your predilection to research way too much. If you're writing a book in 2 years, you don't have time to do what I was doing. I wrote this book over 2 decades. And, you can just keep researching. There's a point at which it's just not that useful. But it's still fascinating if you're like me, look at that. Hey, that's cool. Maybe I can use that. So
Right.
It can be a rabbit hole.
Yes. Okay, so that brings me to another question as to why is Elle Scottish?
Well, I didn't want her to be an American. I'm not sure why, except that I thought originally she was living in New York and working in New York and had gone to the Harvard Business School and had really had become somewhat Americanized. And I left that part in, that she had gone to business school and become somewhat Americanized and worked in New York. But for necessity to cut the story down to something manageable, I chopped out all that part. I thought that she needed to be from the UK. There's a real ongoing historical conversation between those islands that had a lot of British influence and the UK. There are a lot of Nevisians who live in the UK or go to school there, or who live in Canada or who went to school there. There's this sort of Commonwealth aspect of the history of Nevis. And because it's an English-speaking island, it's a highly literate island, I just felt that coming from the UK made more sense. I wanted her, though, to be Scottish versus British, because there was an element of nationalism and pride and homeland kind of fierceness that to me seemed to distinguish. I mean, I know this is really stereotypic, but I did research this as well. If I made her a Scot, I could make her, a ferocious Klansman Highlander Scot. And I wanted some of that history from her family to come into what shaped her and to give her the drive and the fierceness that she has. So I don't know. It just seemed to feel right. Part of it I just pulled from the air, and part of it just felt right as I started to work it and to think through and ask myself all of these character building questions about where did she come from and how did she get this way. And the more I did that, the more I felt that she had to be Scottish versus any place else in the world she could have come from and still be speaking English as a native speaker.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. What are you working on now?
Well, in addition to promoting The Moon Always Rising, which is a full-time job, I am and have been for some time writing a second novel. The name of it is Posthumous, and it is about a New York City literary couple that have deep secrets from each other and from the world. Each of them is not who they appear to be. They are aware to a certain extent of the truth of the other, but not completely. And the world is unaware of who they really are. And the story is a complicated structure. It has a book within a book. But the reader discovers really who these people are by the revelations of the Uber book and the book within a book. And it does not have a ghost. But the wife, I will tell you that the wife has died already on page 1. So she is very much alive in the book through artifacts. So maybe that's a theme of my work, but and through her own words. But she is not actually acting in the book. Her husband is alive in the book. So it's quite. I love it. I love the story. Everybody I talk to about it, when I tell them that, it's got these kinds of secrets, and oh, by the way, there's a lot of Me Too stuff in it as well, because the guy is a powerful pig, but very charming. And so there are some similar themes, I guess, but it takes place in 2017 and onwards, in New York City and the Hamptons, both places I know very well. And, I'm really looking forward to being able to get back to writing on it with more consistency than I have had over the last year.
One more quick break before we conclude the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the work in progress. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Alice C. Early about her novel, The Moon Always Rising, although we are currently talking about her work in progress. So let's get back to that interview.
Right. And so in this case, then I would imagine you're not going to take probably 2 decades, so you don't get to go down as many rabbit holes in the research.
No, I mean, this book does not require that kind of research. What this book requires is that I'm forcing myself to gain skills as a writer that I would like to have. I'm writing in the first person present tense for part of the book. I am writing from 2 different points of view, and the woman is a poet, and I'm trying to force myself to write poetry so that I can have her poems in the book be my own. So I'm using it as a sort of a primer on a lot of things as a writer that I would like to learn, but I do not have to do that kind of research. And I really hope that it doesn't come out 20 years from now when it's already an historical novel. But it won't deal with the pandemic.
Right. So you said that you were an English major in college, but you didn't have your debut novel until now. So clearly, writing is something that you've always wanted to do. How has that? Have you written in other capacities throughout your life, or how has your writing journey looked for you?
I have never not written. How's that for a sentence? I started scribbling little stories when I was 7 or 8. I had some stupid story, in a contest. It was published in, when I was maybe 12. I always made up stories. But after I graduated college, I had to make a living. And I didn't see writing as an option. I didn't know anybody who was a writer, and I didn't see that as a possibility. So I went out and I got a job. And I worked, I was workaholic, let's face it, for years and years and years. And So when I came here in 99, my former firm asked me to write a bespoke history, which I did. And that kind of got the wheels turning. But I always wanted to go back to fiction because my creative writing seminar in my senior year at college, I had written a fiction thesis, which was a short story cycle. If you think Olive Kittredge or Winesburg, Ohio, where you have connected short stories, so it was almost like a novelette written in short stories that were all connected with overlapping characters. And I put that aside, and I never touched that again either. I'm not sure I even have a copy. So it was time to sort of let myself come back to my roots. But even at that, all that writing I'd done in all those years, writing business materials, marketing materials, brochures, proposals, you name it, I was writing sometimes little character studies inside of my business communications, describing a situation and people, communicating with people and trying to capture their essence when I'm as a coach. There's a lot of those same skills that come to bear, and I have a graduate degree in consulting psychology, so understanding people's underlying issues is part of my stock and trade. But, really writing fiction, I just couldn't give myself permission to do that until I was here for quite a while and said, okay, I was taking care of my parents. They're both gone. When my mother died in 2009, I had a little time, and I said, all right, I am not going to give that to my coaching practice. I'm going to start writing again. And that's really when I started taking it seriously, and from then it took 10 years to get that book pulled together.
Wow. Well, way to be persistent. That's definitely...
But I loved it. I mean, your question is, sort of how is it for you to be a writer? And I love it. I mean, I just love it. I love writing. I love revising. Not everybody does. I do, because I think that that's how you sort of sculpt the statue is sculpted out of the stone of what you create when you make that big messy draft. And you make discoveries as you pare it down. You see what its essence really is. I didn't know I was writing a book about forgiveness until I'd finished it and went back and said, oh, my God, that's the theme of my book. I didn't set out to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I've always been a writer. I've always expressed my world in words. But turning that into fiction has been a joy of being unbound by the truth. Now, when I was writing in my business career, it had to be true. It had to be factual. It could be persuasive, but it had to be true. And now I just have to make it believable. And it can be what I want it to be. And that is a joy.
Yeah. When we were talking a little bit before we started recording, you mentioned that you are an avid reader. So what authors and genres are your go-tos for reading for yourself?
I've always loved to disappear into fiction. I love a good story. I have some really, authors I come back to again and again, people like Jeanette Winterson, Barbara Kingsolver, Ann Patchett, Gabrielle Garcia Marquez, Kent Harif, Anne Enright, Allie Smith, and where I tend to gravitate, I think, toward writers who are more spare. Rachel Cusk. I like some experimental writers quite a bit. I like people who are exploring the language. But I also love writers who just can make that perfect sentence where you stop dead and you read it again, and you think, oh, wish I could do that. So as I've been writing this book and trying to be a better citizen, sort of a literary citizen, I've been reading broadly and deeply to try to understand not only the market, but who's writing out there and what are they saying. And it's helped me to learn my craft, but also to understand the world by seeing what sense they make of it. And I just open a book and say, "Oh, goody, what's this going to bring?"
Yes.
I'm reading a wonderful book right now that's called Shuggie Bain. It is by a Scottish author, and it is it's on the long list for the Booker Prize, and it's the language is wonderful. The story is desperately sad and riveting at the same time, as far as I've gone so far. So, I have a huge to be read stack.
Yeah, I understand that.
You do.
I know you have a website, so can you tell us where to find your website as well as where people might be able to interact with you on social media?
Yeah. My website is easy. It's just www.aliceearly.com. And I have a blog there. I'm not as good about blogging regularly as I should be. I'm going to hope to be better at that. But there's information about the book and about me, and a lot of information about where to find interviews like this and where to find reviews and that kind of thing. And people can interact with me there. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm beginning to be on Instagram, which I'm not very good at, but I'm getting there. And I do spend actually a lot of time on social media now interacting with friends and readers, and I'm loving it. It's not something that I did much before my book was out there and people were seeking me out and I wanted to chat with them because I can't see them in person. So virtual experiences and interacting online are the only thing we can do most of the time.
Yep, it's definitely things have definitely changed in the way we interact and communicate with each other.
Yeah.
Well,
and I
Alice,
love
we've talked about. Oh, go ahead.
No, I love book groups. I've done some virtual book groups, and the great advantage of those, of course, is that the people don't even have to be in the same room, and I don't have to be with them, so I don't have to travel. Right. And people in places where I could never get to can meet with me as a group, which I love. And I'm doing some in person here, where the hostess has a big enough garden for everybody to sit outside in a big circle, and those have been enormous fun, and it just makes me yearn for those times in the future when we can get back to meeting in person. But in the meantime, I am really enjoying doing the virtual stuff.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So we've talked about a lot of different things in the course of our conversation, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to highlight about the book or writing, or just anything that we haven't covered?
We thought we were going to talk a little bit maybe about my advice to writers, and I guess I'm almost 72 and proud of it. And I've had several careers. And I think you can be a writer in your last career, but I would encourage people who want to write to write. I really wish that I had given myself permission to do this sooner. I wish that I had taken courses if I felt like I didn't measure up. I could have, I would have probably taken me half as long to write this novel if I'd gone to a novel generator course or something and learned a little bit about what I was really doing. I was so do-it-yourself about this book that it took probably a lot longer than it needed to. And so I would say, embrace your need to be a writer. Go out and be around other writers. You'll learn from them. You'll need their support. Get criticism. Listen to criticism, but don't let it destroy you. Don't let it shift your focus. But pay attention to it. See what resonates. Put it aside if you have to, and let the anger and the whatever you feel subside before you actually encounter it and try to deal with whether it makes any sense. I actually love criticism because it usually reminds me of what I know to be wrong and have not been willing to address. So when I got criticism from my editors, they inevitably nailed me for something I already knew I needed to fix, but just hoped it would slide by. So what it did was to enforce my sense, my intuition, that I actually knew what I was doing, that my senses were good. And I think you need to do that. So if you want to be a writer, be a writer. Make time to be a writer. And, if it's only journaling, that's not an only. If it's journaling, do that. But if you need to write, if you need to put your words together in order to understand your world and your feelings, do it. And don't let anybody dissuade you. You don't ever have to publish it. That's a whole different trip. Once you decide to publish, that's a different thing. But if you want to write, write.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Yes, you noticed. Yeah, I skipped over that question accidentally.
No.
So thanks for bringing us back to it. Well, and I also thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it. I loved talking with you, and so glad we were able to connect to talk about the book. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Thank you once again to Alice for joining me to talk about this book. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners, for you're wonderful. You're wonderful, wonderful listeners, and I appreciate all of you very much. You are my bookworm listeners, or maybe you're my book dragon listeners. Have you seen that meme on social media where, why be a bookworm if you can be a book dragon? I think we're all probably a little bit of book dragons because we have our hoard, our stash of books. So I like book dragon, but be a bookworm, be a book dragon, be a book unicorn for all. I don't care however you identify as long as you love books. And thank you so much for joining me to talk about books. I hope, as always, that you will join me for the next podcast where I will be speaking with author Lydia Kang about one of three, we'll be talking about all three a little bit, but one of her newest in 3 historical novels that she has written. They're all standalone, but they do have connections. This one is called Opium and Absinthe. It takes place in 1899, right at the turn of the century. Not this most recent turn of the century, the last one. Sorry, you're all very smart. You knew that. So it's a historical piece. It is very interesting. There's a mystery. There is a lot of talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula that just came out, and that features into the plot line. I'm not going to tell you how, but definitely join me to hear that interview with Lydia Kang as we talk about Opium and Absinthe. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope that weekend involves plenty of time to get lost in a good book. And I am going to kick myself in the rear end and go to urgent care. So wish me luck that I go to urgent care with a sinus infection and don't come home from urgent care with COVID. That's my hope. Talk to you next time. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.